More than 80 years after the end of the Second World War, almost all of the fighter aces who fought in its skies have passed into history. But in 2026, one remains. His name is Norbert Schücking. At 105 years old, Norbert has lived more than 8 decades beyond the war in which he flew against American bombers and Allied fighters over Europe. During the final years of the conflict, he served with Fighter Wing 11, known simply as JG-11, flying both the Messerschmitt Bf 109G and the FW-190A. And before the war was over, he would become a fighter ace. Norbert's first claimed aerial victory came on the 20th of February 1944, when he shot down American B-17 Flying Fortress over Weimar. It was the beginning of a series of victories against the enormous American bomber formations appearing over Germany. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the Reich in their hundreds, escorted increasingly deep into German territory by American fighters. For Luftwaffe pilots like Norbert, stopping them became an increasingly dangerous task, but his victory tally continued to rise. Following the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, his opponents increasingly became Allied fighters rather than heavy bombers. On the 27th of June north of Aulon-Sun, Norbert claimed a P-47 Thunderbolt as his 10th aerial victory. On the 14th of July, he claimed a Spitfire near Balleroy. Then, 3 days later during fighting around Saint-Lô and Coutances, he claimed another P-47 Thunderbolt followed by a P-51 Mustang. The Mustang became his 13th claimed aerial victory. It would also be his last. Norbert continued flying as Germany's military situation collapsed around him. Then, in February 1945, came perhaps the most extraordinary moment of his wartime career. He was forced to abandon his FW-190A, but there was a problem. He was only around 100 metres, roughly 330 feet above the ground. At that height, a parachute had almost no time to open, but Norbert jumped anyway. His parachute deployed just enough to slow his fall, before he struck the snow-covered ground below. Against extraordinary odds, he survived. Less than 3 months later, the war in Europe was over. By then, Norbert had been awarded the German Cross in Gold, both classes of the Iron Cross, and the Luftwaffe Fighter Operational Flying Clasp. But the life that followed would look completely different. After the war, Norbert met and married his wife Gunda. He settled in Elmshorn, in northern Germany, completed a commercial apprenticeship and went on to spend around 40 years working in the building materials industry. Away from work, hunting and nature became lifelong interests. The decades passed. The thousands of young Luftwaffe pilots who had once filled Germany's fighter squadrons gradually disappeared, but Norbert remained. In January 2026, the city of Elmshorn marked his 105th birthday, celebrating him as its oldest resident. Even at 105, he remained connected to the outdoors, joining hunting friends on trips to observe wildlife. But only a few months later, another event gave Norbert an extraordinary place in aviation history. On the 31st of May 2026, former Luftwaffe fighter ace Hugo Broch died at the age of 104. Broch had been credited with 81 aerial victories during the Second World War, and was one of the final surviving Luftwaffe aces. With his death, Norbert became the last known surviving Luftwaffe fighter ace of the Second World War. More than 80 years after he flew, Norbert was still alive in Elmshorn at the age of 105, a survivor of one of history's most destructive air wars. A fighter pilot who once escaped his aircraft barely 100 metres above the ground. And in 2026, the last living Luftwaffe ace.